Hello, I am Dr. Hans-Martin Pech, and I will be presenting this paper to you together with Dr. Jitendra Sharma. First of all, let me express our gratitude for affording us the opportunity to present our paper to you today. Dr. Sharma is a neuroscientist by training and profession, but he also has studied Professor Ranade's philosophy extensively for many, many years. Meanwhile, I hold a PhD from Harvard University in Germanic languages and literatures with a particular focus on history and philosophy. Since Professor Ranade was particularly fond of Immanuel Kant, the German philosopher, Dr. Sharma and I decided to explore the relationship between the two philosophers, and we present the following paper as an initial approach to the topic. So let me begin. Professor Ranade was very fond of Immanuel Kant. In fact, he considered some of his own work on moral philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita an extension of Kant's three major critiques, namely the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. Namely, a critique of intuition as a faculty that operates even beyond reason, that is, in the spiritual realm. Even though Kant systematically refutes the notion of a theoretical knowledge of God, the concept of God nonetheless plays an important role as a regulative idea of practical reason in Kant's philosophy. Although Kant identifies God as a postulate necessary for moral hope, Ranade regards God as the source, sustainer, and ultimate goal of both morality and spirituality. For Ranade, morality is not just a precondition for mysticism, it is an integral part of the mystical journey itself. We will provide an outline of Kant's views on morality and spirituality, which I will provide. And I will begin with a brief overview of this epistemology, his epistemology, insofar as it relates to these topics. And then Dr. Sharma will discuss Professor Ranade's views on the relationship between morality and spirituality. And in the last step, he will highlight Professor Ranade's relation to Kant's work. In the history of philosophy, Immanuel Kant is most renowned for his revolution in the way of thinking, as he writes himself, in the domain of epistemology. The main goal of Kant's critique of pure reason was to define the limits of human understanding, which ultimately led him to a transcendental idealism with regards to the reality of the objective world. In Kant's cosmology, the reality that is perceived by a thinking subject exists to a certain extent independent from this perceiving individual. But at the same time, its perception is always already shaped by the subject's cognitive faculties. Whenever the human mind encounters sense data, its faculty of intuition, the German Anschauungsvermögen, can only gather this data by organizing it in accordance with the forms of intuition of time and space. Subsequently, the sense data thus organized is interpreted by the categories of understanding. Only under the conditions of this interplay between sensibility and understanding are humans able to gain any kind of knowledge about the empirical world. The nature of the entities that underlie our sense data, insofar as they exist independent of our minds, which Kant would call the thing in itself, in German Ding an sich, or the noumenon, can never be ascertained by the human mind. This does not entail a solipsistic cosmology, in which the subject itself is the source of all its mental representations, but rather empirical reality exists independent and external of the mind. Indeed, the categories of understanding can only be applied to such sense data. If one were to abstract away time and space from the objects of understanding, the categories of understanding would become completely meaningless, since they could not be applied to anything. It is thus possible to consider a noumenon that corresponds to a given phenomenon beyond time and space, but human understanding can only consider it in these negative terms of privation of time and space, never in positive terms. It can never make any kind of further determination about the noumenon. Nonetheless, the noumenal sphere plays a crucial role, particularly with regards to Kant's moral philosophy. In the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant only references the domain of morality insofar as it relates to the limits of human cognition. Because of the nature of the categories of understanding, reason is confronted with a number of antinomies that present conflicting yet equally apodictic, that is, logically necessary judgments about the nature of the world, which are seemingly irresolvable, these conflicting judgments. For instance, the category of causality demands that every phenomenon in the empirical world, including the inner sensibilities such as the cognitive functions of thinking itself, that all these phenomena have a preceding phenomenon as its effective cause. At the same time, the laws of nature also demand completeness, and thus the assumption of an initial cause which itself has no preceding cause. Therefore, reason is confronted with the contradiction of having to assume, on the one hand, an infinite regress of causation, every effect has a cause that precedes it, and on the other hand, an initial cause of all subsequent causes. To solve this contradiction, human reason assumes a different kind of causality that transcends the domain of experience, namely one of freedom. Yet such a spontaneous causality of freedom equally stands in contradiction to the laws of nature, since every initial action requires a previous non-action state of mind as its preceding cause, which is equally a demand of human reason to guarantee the unity of experience. That means that all human experience follows the same rules that are set by reason. The answer to this antinomy lies in the specific epistemological parameters set by Kant's transcendental idealism. All phenomena, when considered only in regards to the way our cognitive faculties present them to us, have no existence outside of our thoughts. Therefore, the laws of nature, as established by the categories of understanding, only apply to these phenomena, but not to the thing in itself that, in the first place, as a mere necessity of thought, corresponds to them in the noumenal sphere. Freedom, a necessary condition for the consideration of any morality, enters Kant's analysis by means of a very subtle argument. Even though every phenomenon is adequately explained by a preceding cause, it is at least not a contradiction to assume the possibility of an action thus explained by the laws of nature also having a corresponding intelligible cause, that is, one within the noumenal sphere of the thing itself. This argument hinges solely on the inscrutable character of the noumenal sphere, to which the categories of understanding cannot be applied, and it leaves only a very narrow understanding of freedom. Similarly, Kant argues with regards to the notion of God. In the history of philosophy, it is perhaps one of Kant's greatest achievements to have definitively refuted the traditional proofs of the existence of God. Yet, the notion of God still has a place in Kant's epistemology as a regulative principle of reason. This is a quote. As a, quote, regulative principle of reason to regard all combination in the world as if it arose from an all-sufficient necessary cause, so as to ground on that cause the rule of a unity that is systematic and necessary according to universal laws. End of quote. From a Kantian epistemological perspective, nothing more than this urge of human reason to find a unifying principle of reality can be ascertained about God. However, the notion of God plays a more complex role in Kant's practical philosophy. Indeed, while morality in the Western tradition before Kant was often derived from the existence of the supreme moral authority, namely of God, Kant equally introduces a revolutionary way of thinking into the foundation of moral action. Let me elaborate on this. Already in the Critique of Pure Reason, when discussing the possibility of a causality from freedom, Kant argues that the mere existence within human reason of an ought, so an obligation of some sorts, shows that pure reason at least innately assumes that a causality from freedom is possible, even if such a causality would never come into existence. This ought expresses in mere abstract terms of pure reason a possible action whose cause is only a concept as opposed to a phenomenon in the domain of experience. First in the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and then later in the critique of practical reason, Kant specifies this kind of ought in the formula of the categorical imperative. While what he calls hypothetical imperatives capture the type of logical ought that is implied in a conditional statement. For example, if you want to eat, you ought to cook a meal. A categorical imperative, in contrast, is one that does not require the preceding condition for the ought to acquire its full binding force. So in the example, the categorical imperative would be just you ought to cook a meal without the preceding condition necessary for the force of the ought. Kant captures, such an imperative would fit the notion of a causality from freedom, since no preceding desire or other phenomenal cause is necessary for this imperative to exist. So Kant captures this spontaneity in different variations of the same concise formula of the categorical imperative. Quote, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law, end of quote. The existence of this imperative constitutes morality, in German Sittlichkeit, morality itself, which is the same as the form of a pure good will, and which emerges from pure reason insofar as it is intelligible, or in other words, insofar as it is a noumenon. Yet the effect of any action in the phenomenal world as the result of the categorical imperative cannot be observed and not even be assumed to ever exist in the phenomenal world. Once again, a world in accordance with the categorical imperative is merely a regulative principle of practical reason. For pure reason, the summum bonum, the highest good, which would be the fulfillment of happiness, constitutes a world in which all phenomena conform completely to the form of a pure will, that is, to the categorical imperative, which is the form of a pure will. But the categorical imperative does not itself already carry the guarantee that such a correspondence between morality and happiness, i.e. the realization of the demands of morality, be possible to exist in the phenomenal world. Therefore, God is postulated by practical reason as the unifying principle which, as the assumed first cause of the world, is thought of as having designed the world in such a way that its transformation in accordance with the demands of the categorical imperative be possible. In other words, God is the guarantor for the possibility of morality coming into the world. However, even though this postulate is necessary in moral terms, it is merely subjective. That is, it has the form merely of a desire of the reasonable subject, of the thinking human being, and in this case specifically, a desire of pure reason. As such, God is the object of the belief of reason, but it can never be the object of discursive knowledge. Kant revises this very limited scope of the concept of God in his Opus Posthumum, which is a series of notes discovered after Kant's death. Here, he more directly derives human reason's necessity to postulate God's existence from the nature of the categorical imperative itself. Although Kant's argument remains at times obscure, he asserts that the categorical imperative presents itself to human reason as a lawgiver and judge, as he says, and thus as the command of a person, which person in Kant's terminology always means a being that possesses the faculty of reason. Since the categorical imperative has itself no cause independent of it, this person has only rights and no duties. And this characteristic only applies to God. However, Kant insists that the existence of such a being can never be proven or experienced directly, but that it is only the product of the factual existence of the categorical imperative within one's reason. Quote, "The idea of such a being, before whom all knees bow, etc., emerges from this imperative and not the reverse. And a God is thought necessarily, subjectively, in human practical reason, although not given objectively. Hereupon is founded the proposition of the knowledge of all human duties as divine commands." End of quote. It can thus be said that the inexplicable yet uncompromising fact of morality within human reason, which is given by the categorical imperative, is the narrow path that leads to discovering God. And with this, I hand it over to Dr. Sharma, who will now discuss Professor Ranade's views on morality and spirituality.